Guest speaker this evening is Greg Peterson, president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. On January 16th of this year, Greg traveled to Nuremberg, Germany, with John Barrett, an Elizabeth Lene Fellow to the Jackson Center, and Warren Erickson, a professor and attorney in Jamestown. They spent 4 days traveling to various sites in and around Nuremberg. Greg will now tell us something about that trip.
Congratulations. Congratulations to the Temple Hesed Abraham for taking the time, the opportunity, and to reminding all of us about something very important, this remembrance that we will never forget. And this certainly was a concept which was driven home to me just this past January when we went to Nuremberg. As Joe mentioned, I am the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, a center which is designed to preserve the legacy of Justice Robert Jackson. What is the legacy of Justice Robert Jackson? A man who was born in 1892 in Spring Creek Township, Pennsylvania. If you don't know where that is, go to the Deerhead Inn down in Spring Creek, that's where it's at. Who at age 5 came to Frewsburg, New York, and there he stayed through his high school years. Came to Jamestown, did a postgraduate year, never went to college. I'll repeat that, never went to college. Went to 1 year of Albany Law School, never graduated. Came back, read for the law, and at the earliest age possible, took the bar exam and passed it. He practiced law in Jamestown for 20 years. He represented some folks that you now know as Key Bank, Altel, National Fuel, among others. He represented the full spectrum from labor union individuals, up to corporations. During this period of time while he was here, Jackson was very much a staunch Democrat, one of the few Democrats in Chautauqua County, one of the very few lawyers, Fred, Democrats in Chautauqua County. And as a result, while at Albany, he was curious about what was going on at state government. He was introduced to a Democratic assemblyman from Dutchess County named Franklin Roosevelt, and through that process developed a relationship. As Roosevelt's star rose, so did Jackson's, and in 1934 became a member of what we now know as the Internal Revenue Service. He was a trial counsel, took on a guy named Mellon, was successful. If you ever go down to Washington and see the portrait gallery with big sign that says donated by the beneficence of Andrew Mellon, it was really given to him as a result of a settlement of a tax fraud case, which Jackson prosecuted. Another whole story. He became Assistant Attorney General, Solicitor General, where one of the foremost Jewish justices of all time, Louis Brandeis, allowed us how that Justice Jackson should be Solicitor General for life because of his articulate use of the King's English. He then became Attorney General, and while as Attorney General, he was involved in writing the opinion which justified the Lend-Lease for President Roosevelt. 1941, he became selected by President Roosevelt to become a Justice of the Supreme Court. Not bad for a guy who never went to college and only went to 1 year of law school. Pretty proud moment. And he stayed on the Supreme Court right through his death in 1954, and in 1954 he died, and the Supreme Court of the United States, for what we believe to be the only time ever in the history of the Supreme Court, in mass, came to Jamestown to celebrate his life and to attend the funeral at St. Luke's. Chief Justice Earl Warren and all, Hugo Black, Felix Frankfurter, all those individuals were here to talk about Justice Jackson. However, the piece which we're here to talk about and the part of the biography of Justice Jackson, which he wrote was his most prominent part of his life, was a period of time which Joe had already introduced as that time where he was the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trial. Not only was he that, but he was also the guy who was individually responsible for coordinating, co-opting, convincing the Allies that there ought to be a trial which would demonstrate once and for all that, in fact, the atrocities that occurred in Germany. After the end of World War I, and part of the Versailles Treaty, the Germans were supposed to have their own international war crimes trial. It failed. This time, and for the first time in the history of mankind, the United States, Britain, France, and Russia joined what we now know as the London Agreement to set up a protocol for a trial which would put on record, a trial which would permit the defendants to have counsel, a trial which would hopefully set forth a prototype for years to come. The signator on the London Agreement, if you go into the National Archives of the four countries, the signator for the United States of America, Robert H. Jackson. Again, not bad for a guy who never went to college, 1 year of law school, and here from little old Jamestown, New York. To be honest with you, these are facts that even I had no idea about until we really got into this. Justice Jackson felt very strongly about Nuremberg. And in fact, when we got started here at the Jackson Center less than 3 years ago, one of our first guests here was a gentleman by the name of Michael Berenbaum. Michael Berenbaum wrote a book entitled Witness to the Holocaust. Michael Berenbaum was the curator of the Holocaust Museum. Michael Berenbaum was a speaker at Chautauqua. It's a long baseball story, but I befriended him because he's a Brooklyn Dodger fan. It's another story too. But through baseball, he came down here, he checked us out. And we interviewed Michael for 2 hours because he's currently the executive director of the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles, which Steven Spielberg funded. He came in here and I asked him what it meant to the remembrance, the Holocaust. What does Justice Jackson mean to all that? He said, Justice Jackson, his desire, and believe me, he was under a lot of criticism to leave the Supreme Court, but his willingness to step down from the Supreme Court to take on the case which would in fact document for all time the horrors of the Holocaust was something that he, for one, and the Jewish faith too, will never forget, because that added immediate credibility. It set also a template for guys like Justice Richard Goldstone, who most recently did the same thing in South Africa under the when they had hearings there. And it was Michael Berenbaum who went on to say that what we're doing here is something which he would support, not only encouraged us, and we've been in close contact with him, but he also turned me to the book, and within his book he had certain remembrances of the Holocaust. And since the Robert Jackson Center is really designed to preserve the legacy of Justice Jackson, it's important, especially today, to stop and see what that legacy was in the form of the Nuremberg Trial. I'm going to read the excerpts from the opening statement of the prosecution. And I'll talk a little bit about it, but I'm also going to change my format I had a video, but I frankly can't wait to hear Fred Friedman, so I'm going to do a little bit something different. But these words that he gave at the opening of the prosecution at the first Nuremberg trial, November 21st, 1945. Justice Jackson, may it please your honors, the privilege of opening the first trial in history for crime against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been calculated so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. that four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power ever has paid to reason. This opening paragraph has been used frequently through trials which we have currently going on at The Hague, trials in Rwanda, and it's that statement, that prototype by Justice Robert Jackson. Again, guy never went to college, 1 year of law school, Jamestown guy. It ripples today. He went on. The opening statement lasted for about 3 hours. And it was written up by a variety of national New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, et cetera, as really one of the foremost pieces of English oratory probably ever. And it's been used often in forensic courses and other law courses. But what's he say about crimes against the Jews? The most savage and numerous crimes planned and committed by the Nazis were those against the Jews. These in Germany in 1933 numbered about 500,000. That was just in Germany. In the aggregate, they had made for themselves positions which excited envy and had accumulated properties which excited the avarice of the Nazis. They were few enough to be helpless and numerous enough to be held up as a menace. Let there be no misunderstanding about the charge of persecuting Jews. What we charge against these defendants is not those arrogances and pretensions which frequently accompany the intermingling of different peoples and which are likely, despite the honest efforts of government, to produce regrettable crimes and convulsions. It is my purpose to show a plan and a design to which all Nazis were fanatically committed to annihilate all Jewish people. These crimes were organized and promoted by the party leadership, executed and protected by the Nazi officials, as we shall convince you by written orders of the secret state police itself. And it goes on from there. Justice Jackson, when he returned from Nuremberg, reflected back on that part of his life as one which he felt was the most meaningful to him, as I mentioned earlier. We have had at the Jackson Center, we've been blessed and privileged to have at the Jackson Center these past 3 years, prosecutors who were with Justice Jackson at Nuremberg. Needless to say, they're in their 80s, some in their 90s. They've all come here. Nobody ever receives or accepts, though we offer, honorariums. They come here to tip the hat to Justice Robert Jackson. What is the message? The message is that the Nuremberg Trial, which today is still argued about the variety of the nuances of it, but one thing they're all agreed upon, that the evidence and the decision that was made to provide the evidence of the documentation of the Holocaust will never be denied. Though there are attempts, as you know, of deniers of the Holocaust, the fact of the Nuremberg trial, the evidence was presented. All of the defendants who were there all had their attorneys, their opportunities to exclude the evidence. Not one piece of evidence was excluded. So it's there for all time to prove the existence of the Holocaust of which we remember here today. We've even had, most recently, Bud Schulberg. Bud Schulberg, who an Academy Award-winning film screenwriter for On the Waterfront, but he was involved in the documentation, the creation of the movies which were shown at the Nuremberg trial. He was riveting. 90 years old, and he had to find, edit, present to the Nuremberg trial the movies which probably the most poignant parts of it. Again, another one of those individuals who came here to pay respect to Justice Jackson, and to also be sure that that piece of legal history became something which will never be forgotten. Again, a wonderful thing, a wonderful legacy to a guy who is from Jamestown, New York, who never went to college, never graduated from law school. I'm going to stop now. Joe has invited everyone to take a tour of the Jackson Center afterwards. We have some folks from the Jackson Center who will be around to certainly answer questions, and I know some of you may have been looking forward to a 10-minute piece on Nuremberg video, but I'm going to stop. I'll show it later for anybody who wants to watch it, because I can't wait to listen to our next speaker. Thank you.